Arlington, Virginia, September 11, 2001. An event took place at the Pentagon in which the government claims was caused by an attack jet. Many local witnesses claim to have observed this aircraft roaring through the skies. Citizen investigation team filled numerous independent witnesses on location who placed the attack jet on a very different path than required by the government story and physical damage. In 9/11, Attack on the Pentagon, we demonstrate how these witnesses could not be mistaken in their placement of the plane. A myth was adopted by those who make excuse for the government story that this flight path is aerodynamically impossible. We'll call them detractors. We are now about to bust that myth.
13 independent witnesses filmed on location by CIT have drawn the flight paths as close as possible to what they remember. Of course, witness statements will be slightly different from one another, but what they all agree was that the aircraft was on the north path, opposite the required government flight path. Several scenarios were calculated by detractors in what they claimed reasonable, based on witness statements, yet aerodynamically impossible for a 757. Note: those who make excuse for the government story refuse to sign their name to such claims, nor illustrate their flight paths based on their calculations. We took the liberty to illustrate the flight paths based on detractor calculations. Any intelligent person looking at such a diagram will immediately realize there is nothing reasonable about their paths as compared to witness statements and drawings. As you can see, it is clear why such detractors will never put their name to such claims, as their real names will be readily discredited for such an absurd notion as this being reasonable with what witnesses have drawn and stated. Clearly one witness statement was cherry-picked, Terry Moran's statement of parallel with the Navy Annex, and all the rest of the witnesses, including their drawings, were ignored in order to not disrupt the extreme bias of those who try to confuse honest researchers. It is clear the main objective of those who make excuses for the government story is to detract and sow confusion, as anyone can cherry-pick one witness statement, creating a wild flight path to be impossible. The problem with trying to demonstrate a north path based on witness statements is it will be based mostly on speculation regarding aircraft type, speed, and other factors. With that said, the general location of the north path becomes more fact than speculation or mistaken memory, with each independent witness statement and path drawn. Although pilots for 9/11 Truth do not speculate or offer theory, we will demonstrate how the north path is very much aerodynamically possible when averaging witness statements and drawings at various speeds, despite the biased attempts by detractors who created a myth to suggest otherwise. Ironically, another detractor type, of sorts, realized the intellectual dishonesty of the wild flight paths calculated by his peers and came up with one of his own. This path is aerodynamically possible in contrast to what his peers have claimed regarding the north approach. But as you can see, it is a bit adjusted to detractor bias. You can see the path crosses south of the impact point and south of edge shot. When adjusted properly, it not only is very much aerodynamically possible, but becomes more consistent with what witnesses describe, as you will soon witness yourself. First, we have to examine the facts. Fact: all witnesses interviewed to date saw an aircraft. 13 witnesses to date place the aircraft on the north side, opposite the physical damage. 0 witnesses place the aircraft on the south path. Next, we have to examine the variables. It is a logical fallacy to assume the aircraft observed on the northern approach to be a 757, and most detractors agree. If the numerous independent witnesses are correct regarding the placement of the aircraft opposite the physical damage, the only conclusion is that the attack on the Pentagon was not what we were told by our government and the 9/11 Commission. Any type aircraft could have been used, including those with classified military technology. Again, unlike the alleged path, we do not know speed, vertical speed, altitude, or exact location other than the general location of the aircraft approach north of the Citgo gas station. We will have to generalize these figures. The north approach calculations will be based on an average path across witness statements and their drawings, a true reasonable flight path. We will demonstrate the path at several different speeds. Since we do not know type aircraft, we also do not know aircraft configuration, weight, or center of gravity. Therefore, stall speed analysis is impossible, an issue anonymous detractors who cannot be verified as experts fail to disclose, most likely due to the fact they aren't aware of such factors. This is the flight path illustrated in 9/11 attack on the Pentagon we just released, based on overall witness statements and drawings. In order to determine if this path is aerodynamically possible, we need to determine the radius of this path. Using the 3-point arc radius tool with this 3D software program as used in Attack on the Pentagon for G-force, and an orthogonal top view to eliminate errors due to perspective, we can determine radius. Scale for this model is 1 centimeter equals 100 feet. For those who wish to double check the accuracy of the radius, feel free to pause the video, take a screenshot, and determine the sagitta of the arc using the screenshot on a Google Earth overlay. With length of the chord and the sag of the arc, one can use a formula to determine the radius. The scale is also demonstrated here with 3 crucial reference points: the alleged impact point to the northwest corner of the Citgo and center of Ed Pake's shop. You can cross-reference these numbers with Google Earth Measure Tool. The radius of this arc is 12,748 feet. To determine if such a path is aerodynamically possible for a conventional aircraft, we need to determine the bank angle at a given speed, and from there we can determine G-load. This is a common formula used by aeronautical engineers to determine the radius of a turn or arc. With some simple algebra, we can solve the formula for bank angle theta. Using a flight data recorder speed of 460 knots, as we will demonstrate first for all scenarios, we get a bank angle of 55 degrees and roughly 1.8 Gs, well within the bank angle and G limits of any conventional aircraft flying today capable of such speeds. Keep in mind, this bank angle is based on flight data recorder speed reported as roughly 460 knots for this segment. It is actually a bit lower when averaging the speed along this segment as plotted by the NTSB, which will ultimately lower the bank angle and therefore G-loads required. But we'll give our detractors every possible chance and use the higher number. Also keep in mind, 460 knots exceeds the maximum operating speed of a 757 set by the manufacturer by 110 knots. Now, since this path doesn't fly directly over the impact point, and our detractors will no doubt cry about it, we will adjust to the impact point to see if this is aerodynamically possible. We have removed the topography so the viewer can see the arc more clearly. We now get 11,000 10-foot radius. Input that into the formula using FDR speed for velocity again, and we get a bank angle of 59 degrees and still less than 2 Gs. Again, aerodynamically possible. Since we are using the north path as described by witnesses, we cannot expect witnesses to be accurate down to the foot. So even with slight differences in flight path, yet being consistent with the north approach, one notices extreme changes to aerodynamic requirements based on radius. Again, we'll remove the topography in order for the viewer to see the arc more clearly. With slight adjustment, we get a radius of 19,406 feet. When we plug that into the formula, again using FDR speed, we get 44-degree bank angle with roughly 1.4 G. Not only is this aerodynamically possible based on bank and G load, but now it is becoming consistent with witness statements. Further slight adjustment reveals 59,355 feet for the radius. Based on FDR speed, we get a bank angle required of 17 degrees and just over 1 G. Again, very much aerodynamically possible, and consistent with witness statements. Remember, since we are demonstrating the north path based on witness statements, we do not have any hard data for the northern approach such as speed, type aircraft, weight, center of gravity location, aircraft configuration, and so on. Stall speed is impossible to determine. However, since every single bank and corresponding G-load calculated for each arc is less than the required bank for the flight testing of pilots in a common training exercise required every 6 months, all arcs are well above stall for any conventional aircraft, but may not be aerodynamically possible based on excessive speed. Again, 460 knots as used from the FDR is already 110 knots over the maximum operating limits of a 757. We are still trying to obtain wind tunnel data from Boeing to determine if the 757 can even obtain such a speed without tearing itself apart due to several factors such as flutter, and the main reason a max operating limit is established by the manufacturer. So, although the calculated bank angles and G-loads are aerodynamically possible, the speed alone, as reported by the NTSB, may not be possible for a 757.
In the slow XL to 85. Terminate.
Knock it off. We lost it.
Max operating limit for a 757 is 350 knots. We will now use a more reasonable speed of 300 knots, and a speed which was used by our detractors. Using 300 knots for the same radii, we get again, all aerodynamically possible and consistent with witness statements. If we further reduce the speed to 200 knots, the bank angle required for such an approach is a non-event and now starts to become inconsistent with witness statements due to a bank which is too shallow. Our detractors may be crying at this point, since the arc appears too close to the edge of the Sitco when considering the statements of Lagasse. But remember, witnesses aren't able to determine down to the foot, and Lagasse himself even said,
The only thing that's debatable is maybe it was closer, maybe it was further away, but it was on that side.
This statement, of course, is a statement the detractors love to ignore. Hence their wild flight paths completely inconsistent with witness drawings. Considering the fact Terry Moran suggests the aircraft was parallel to the Navy Annex, the only reasonable arc shown nearly parallel with the Annex ultimately takes it closer to the Sitco but still on the north path, as described by Robert Tercios. Even if we disregard Terry Moran's statements of nearly parallel on just the path further out, as admittedly debatable by Lagasse himself, the flight path is still aerodynamically possible, unlike what detractors have claimed. When looking at Robert's testimony placing the aircraft over the south parking lot after the explosion event at the Pentagon, we see this as even aerodynamically possible, depending on aircraft type, weight, CG, and aircraft configuration. For those who feel a large aircraft is unable to perform such a bank at lower speeds,
Whoa! Diga que ele quebrou cai. Eu já vi que não é
Olha a altura do gajo. A altura do gajo.
Este gajo é completamente chafrado.
Again, what detractors fail to disclose is that stall speed is dependent on aircraft type, configurations such as slats and flaps, weight, and center of gravity. It is interesting to note that Robert's statements lines up perfectly with runway 15 at DCA. Now, if we factor in the winds, which were almost 90 degrees to the path of aircraft pushing it south, which would ultimately require less bank and therefore less G-load, the north of the Sitco flight path is not only aerodynamically very possible, but according to witnesses, it's what happened. We now examine the flight path drawn by the one detractor with the most reasonable flight path. You can compare the scale of our model with a measurement of the Pentagon wall. The radius for this path is 8,616 feet. But remember, this path was adjusted to detractor bias, such as south of the alleged impact hole, thereby making the radius tighter. When adjusted properly based on witness drawings, the path radius is 12,990 feet.
Every path we have demonstrated is aerodynamically possible, unlike the claims made by detractors with their arbitrary and wild flight path calculations, which they claim are reasonable based on witness statements and drawings. As demonstrated, there is nothing reasonable about their calculations with respect to the full set of witnesses, and is no doubt the reason they did not illustrate their calculations while also refusing to put their names to such claims. The only issue detractors have proven is that it's possible for anyone to speculate on their bias when cherry-picking witness statements. We'll let the viewer decide who is being more intellectually honest and reasonable regarding flight path possibility, consistent with witness statements and drawings. It is clear why detractors refuse to put their names to their claims, calculations, and papers. A tech paper is offered as a supplement to this presentation at pilotsfor911truth.org. Thank you for watching.